The Founders on Earth History, Part 5, received by Sal Rachel. Greetings, beloved creators. We are back already with more on your history. There are two time periods that have held fascination with many of you for a long time, and that is ancient Egypt and the time of Jesus Christ. We will spend a little time on those two sagas now, without forgetting the South American and native North American story to be given at a later date. The so-called battle between light and dark continued after the destruction of Atlantis. Your world seemed to seesaw between periods of brief enlightenment, followed by times of corruption and relative darkness. Egypt was a case in point. A group of 7th density Pleiadians, determined to restore the blueprint of humanity, long lost to Orion, Draco, Sirian, Andromedan and other renegade groups, took advantage of the fact that the few survivors of Atlantis were relatively pure in heart and mind. Those that landed along the Nile River were the first to be visited by the Pleiadian Welcoming Committee. This contingent was headed by a teacher later named Thoth, who, contrary to ancient writings, did not have the head of a bird or reptile. The creature depicted as such was a Draco-Andromedan hybrid, who came along much later and corrupted the teachings of Thoth. Thoth was a radiant being of blue, white light, a humanoid with similar colour and energy to ourselves in the higher realms. He was able to step his vibration down far enough to communicate directly with the descendants of Atlantis and teach them in the ways of truth, cooperation, harmony, and higher mathematics. As many channeled writings will confirm, Thoth was the engineer behind the Great Pyramid. This device served several purposes, but its primary function was an ascension chamber and controller of Earth's grid system. As correctly pointed out by your Egyptologists, it was aligned with Mintaka, the central star in Orion's belt. Mintaka became the central point in Orion's enlightened government following the resolution of the Rigel-Betelgeuse Wars about 100,000 years ago. Mintaka also had geographical and geological significance in that it indicated a central axis point of Earth's precession of grand cycles occurring every 25,920 years approximately. The grid system of Earth was correlated with the point at Giza being the centre of the grid, and ley lines and vortexes coming off at various sacred geometric angles therefrom. The Martians during their heyday had a similar grid system constructed at the same latitude and longitude on their planet, also engineered by 7th density Pleiadians. But alas, it never achieved its potential as a portal for ascension due to interference from Orion and Draco factions. Another strategic purpose of the Great Pyramid was to serve as an incoming portal for groups of Pleiadians, so that the purity and vision of the original blueprint would have a fighting chance of getting re-established on Earth. Thoth and his group had a fair degree of success in working with the Atlanteans to construct temples of initiation and soul evolution along the banks of the Nile. Of the several thousand Atlanteans who made this area their home, a significant percentage took part in the ascension activities and initiations in the Great Pyramid. The 7th density Pleiadians constructed the device in a matter of days using levitation and laser technology. A series of passageways were designed to accommodate those who needed extended periods inside the device in order to accelerate their ascension templates in preparation for moving into 5th density light bodies. The subterranean chambers beneath the Giza Plateau were already inhabited by those who had escaped underground during previous conflagrations. The Pleiadians in concert with these underground groups, established the Hall of Records several thousand feet below the Great Pyramid. The Sphinx was later erected by another group of Egyptians to mark the entrance to the portal. The pyramid was completed in approximately 10,500 BC. It has only been in the last 20 years that scientists on your world have correctly dated the Great Pyramid. Until recently, it was assumed this device was linked to various other pyramids that were constructed using the labour of the Egyptian people to serve as tombs for the pharaohs. This channel goes into detail in his book on the lame attempts by later Egyptians to reconstruct the ascension chambers after Egypt had fallen to the Syrians. We will have more on that later. Accounts from adepts of the original mystery schools of Thoth can be found sporadically in various stone tablets and channeled writings, including the Emerald tablets. Essentially, they document the initiations given to prepare the 4th density souls for ascension into 5th density. Ancient Egypt thrived until 7,500 BC, at which time 7th density Syrians from the Sirius B star system arrived on the scene and began unravelling the work of Thoth and his group. The Christian, Jewish and Greek legends and myths are all about the Syrians. Although these ET factions had great technological and psychic power, they had not resolved their egoic issues satisfactorily, and as a result became infatuated with worship and praise by their underlings. In other words, they were on a guru trip, to quote a popular phrase. At first, it was subtle. They demonstrated their miraculous powers to those who did not have the spiritual understanding to see through the charade. As they intermingled and interbred, the DNA of the descendants became more and more polluted with their brand of egoistic messiahship. The mystery schools began to devolve into pecking orders and devotion to Syrian gods. The God of the Old Testament, Jehovah, was a 7th density Syrian. Those of you familiar with Jehovah's teachings, but unwilling to accept the premise that Jehovah was an egotistical Syrian, should examine the result of Jehovah's presence on the earth. As stated many times by this channel, the Old Testament is one of the bloodiest and most violent books ever written. Would a highly evolved, enlightened being pit one race against another? Would he order blind obedience to his principles? Would he exalt some over others? In God's universe, there are no elite or chosen ones. Everyone is chosen and is created in pure love and innocence. Everyone has equal value in the eyes of God, and that value is infinite. Biblical scholars, Jewish and Christian clerics on your world need to go back to basics and examine the results of ancient teachings. Did they promote peace and evolution of awareness, or did they promote division and conflict? We the founders seldom preach, but this point is too important to let pass. Now, on with the show. We return you to Egypt during its fall into worship and sacrifice. At the same time as the Syrian invasion, after 7,500 BC, the Orions and Dracos began arriving on the scene, and a degree of interbreeding ensued, resulting in many of the part reptilian, part avian, part human forms depicted in later Egyptian drawings. The bird people were a hybrid Draco-Andromedan race, the result of creative DNA engineering, and they attempted to land their native forms on the Earth with partial success. They, like the Syrians, used their superior technology and psychic powers to enslave the docile inhabitants of Egypt. You can find drawings of the Syrian and Draco-Andromedan gods on the walls of caves throughout Egypt. The pure in heart and mind, seeing the experiment once again go awry, sadly retreated back to the inner planes, and a period of relative darkness descended over Egypt. The ritual sacrifices, mummies, and mystery schools of the pharaohs were all the manifestation of Syrian, Orion, Draco, and Andromedan corruption of the original Pleiadian teachings. Had the teachings of Thoth been fully integrated by his students, they would never have been corruptible. The lesson here should be obvious by now. Unless you have fully integrated your ego and higher consciousness, you can be led astray by seemingly well-meaning teachers who themselves have not integrated their egos with spirit. Let us recap and say a few words about the story so far. As many of you know, we have left a lot out and skipped some major periods and events. This is for the sake of brevity. If this channel is willing, we will include these missing pieces in an upcoming book. We have enough information to fill several books, and we feel it is vital that this material be disseminated as you approach the next grand cycle. We will have a special discourse on the implications of cosmic cycles in the near future. We have not touched on the significance of the ancient Hebrew teachings, the Tree of Life, Kabbalah, or other aspects of the higher teachings brought forth since the time of Atlantis by various enlightened members of the Pleiadian, Andromedan, Syrian, Orion, Arcturian, and other groups. We have also had very little to say about the Galactic Confederation, the Great White Brotherhood, the Angelic Orders, and the Universal Orders, including the Order of Melchizedek. This channel has a strong Venusian connection, another ET faction that deserves mention in future segments. One 8th density member of the Confederation, in fact its leading member in this sector of the galaxy, has a special story that we joyfully relate below. At this time, we wish to illuminate your minds regarding the real story of Jesus Christ. It is important to note that the allegorical storyline of one being sacrificed to heal the sins of the masses did not originate with the events 2,000 years ago, but is a theme that has been repeated many times throughout history, long before the man you know as Jesus was carried to the cross. If you dig into the history of different cultures, you will find other such icons whose stories are very similar to that of Jesus. The idea that a saviour died for your sins, and the playing out of that drama in a form similar to Jesus, is an attempt by the Dark Lords to get humanity to place the blame outside of themselves in order to keep their problems from being solved. Let's get this straight. Nobody can ever die for your sins, beloveds. That is for two reasons. First, you have free will and are responsible for everything you do, and second, there is no such thing as an unpardonable error or an error that causes you to be defective. You are as perfect as the day God created you, and you will always be perfect and innocent and holy. Lord Sanada, in his book set A Course in Miracles, made that very clear. There are some factual aspects to the story as told in the New Testament of the Bible, but there are many distortions. Allow us to elaborate. The soul known as Jesus was a direct fragment of the Sanada lineage. In other words, Sanada was the oversoul of Jesus. Sanada, having watched as humankind once again floundered in sorrow and ignorance, and having a desire to intervene in the affairs of man in a way that respected free will, incarnated in approximately 39 BC as the son of Joseph and Mary. This much is in general agreement with the biblical story. Jesus' birth date was approximately March 31st. Lord Sanada, an 8th density celestial being, incarnated as Yeshua or Joshua, depending on whose translation you use. Being from the 8th density, he retained many of his spiritual abilities, despite the very dense environment he was born into. As a young child, he was very psychic and foresaw many of the events that would later come to pass. Mary and Joseph were at odds with the political establishment to some degree, and they were not married when Mary became pregnant. The virgin birth story is made up. Certain ET factions have the capabilities of impregnating women without going through normal sexual means. But in this case, Yeshua came in through normal means. To avoid the social and political consequences of giving birth out of wedlock, and to remove themselves from the oppressive beliefs of the authorities, Mary and Joseph migrated toward Galilee and eventually near the Dead Sea, where they briefly took refuge with the Essenes. Mary and Joseph left Yeshua in their care and returned to Galilee. Yeshua later joined the Essene order. He spent 3 years building temples and housing for the Essenes, while attending their sacred teachings and learning the Essenes way. Along the banks of the Dead Sea, Yeshua learned to have respect for Mother Earth and had a hand in helping bring the much-needed rain, scarce in that region. The Essenes were strict vegetarians and taught a respect for all life forms. They were regarded as strange and antisocial by the governments of the land, but were left largely alone, as they seemed to pose no threat, always paid their taxes, even though they did not believe in such matters. When Yeshua turned about 16, he and a fellow group of Essenes travelled east to India, where he met several Indian gurus and saints. He studied for about 2 years with a guru who taught him a great deal about the mysteries of life. When he returned, and during a dangerous visit to see his parents in Galilee, he met and fell in love with Mary Magdalene, who was a dancer and entertainer and only very briefly prostituted herself when times were tough. Mary M. and Yeshua were deeply in love with each other and had a child. Because they were not married, they too became social outlaws. Some of Yeshua's Essene friends allowed Mary M. to stay at the temples with Yeshua against the rules of the elders. Yeshua, Mary M., and their young son travelled to India a second time, where the child was blessed by the gurus. Word got out that Mary M. had an illegitimate child, although nobody seemed to know the father outside of the Essenes. Fearing for the child's life, Mary M. and Yeshua left the child temporarily in the care of an Indian saint and returned to Galilee. It was a few years later before they could return to India, and although they missed their son terribly, they knew he was all right. Mary M. and Yeshua paid another visit to their son a few years later, but he remained in the care of the Indian saints when they returned. The political climate was too unstable to risk bringing the child back with them to Galilee. Despite the short time they spent with their son, their influence helped him greatly as he grew up in India. Their son became a wise sage, and his teachings added significantly to the climate of India. Yeshua received several visions from Spirit and his soul family, and was told to teach higher spiritual principles to anyone who would listen sincerely. He began teaching earnestly in his late 20s and gathered quite a following. At one point, he had about 50 disciples. He and Mary M. kept their relationship and child a complete secret, not even discussing this with the closest disciples. Being highly clairvoyant, Yeshua saw that the authorities would eventually kill him, but he was told by his own God self to stay his course and teach as many people as possible the ways of Spirit. Yeshua's teachings were highly distorted in the Bible, but a few truths managed to get through. He taught that we are all created in the image and likeness of our Creator, and that we all have the abilities He demonstrated. He taught us to love one another and to forgive our enemies. He did not teach that the way to God was through Him alone. several of his disciples learned how to use their spiritual gifts of healing and clairvoyance, and there are ample stories in the Bible of John going on to perform similar healings. The story of Yeshua's involvement in the Melchizedek priesthood is also in the Bible, in Hebrews chapter 7. Once Yeshua reached a certain level of awareness, his cosmic family in the celestial realms began communicating with him and reminding him of his position within the Melchizedek priesthood. When Yeshua was brought to the cross, he immediately left his body consciously instead of suffering 3 days, as is taught erroneously. During his life, he continually forgave them, for they knew not what they did. After leaving his body, he holographically projected himself back into human form to appear to his disciples and Mary M on numerous occasions. The body left the tomb because grave robbers stole it. He had no need to resurrect it, as he was already able to materialize a new body once he returned to 8th density. Lord Sanada has fragmented his soul several more times throughout history. At the present time, there are 8 fragments of Sanada on the earth. Some of these souls believe they are Jesus, and to a certain extent they are correct. Many great souls are capable of fragmenting themselves dozens of times in order to do service work on lower density planets. Usually oversouls fragment into 12 souls at a time, but this is not set in stone. Many fragments remain in the higher densities to guide the fragments in the lower worlds. The term fragment does not mean incomplete or partial. Each of these fragments is a complete and sovereign being. This channel uses the cell dividing analogy to explain this in his writings. The second coming of Christ refers to the return to Christ consciousness, or the celestial consciousness of higher densities. This was correctly interpreted by your Paramansa Yogananda and many other yogis and saints. As most of you know, traditional Christianity has very little to do with the teachings of Yeshua, and a whole lot to do with sin and guilt. Fortunately, many souls are expanding their awareness beyond these primitive beliefs. We, the founders, are grateful to see so many truly doing the greater works that Yeshua taught. During this brief look at the work of Yeshua, we only touched briefly on Mary M and the Divine Feminine, and spoke hardly a word about Mother Mary. There are numerous channeled articles on these beings, and we do not wish to duplicate the information. We hope we have set the record straight on the lifetime of the one you call Jesus. We are the founders.